This is the first time that a documentary transformed into a global social movement. Your documentary is Zeitgeist. What is the main message that you want to send to the people in all over the world with this work that you have done?
The main message is the dire necessity to change the global economy. That's the most pragmatic message or the most direct message, but there's a deeper meaning to it, and that is we need to think about the world as a unified structure and think about humanity as a connected interfacing species that can't compete and fight and play these games that we've been playing with each other for thousands of years now, because it's destroying the society, it's destroying the planet. So the economic structure links to both of those things. We are producing far more than the planet can generate right now because the entire economy is based on consumption, right? It's based on jobs. You have to have jobs, you need demand, which means everyone has to buy. It means everybody has to take out loans to get money, and you end up with this system that cyclically self-destructs because there ends up being too much debt in the system, people can't pay it back, and then you are basing it on consumption, so you end up consuming more resources again than the planet is actually producing. And with this little kernel seed element of our old economy, because it's a very old structure, and I can clarify any of this as we go along, as I'm speaking broadly, this is creating conflict, and it's hurting people, and it's destroying big pockets of civilization. The most notable destruction is in the global south, which we have the most of the poverty. The vast majority of the poverty and premature death occurs in Latin America, Central America, South America. So that's been the most abused, the most colonialization, all the things that have happened through globalization, which is the new colonialization. So all of these economic things come into play, and it's all based around this need to exploit and compete and to have dominance. And that's a destructive pattern that we need to stop as a species if we intend to coexist with each other and the planet. And with the advent of new diseases, with the advent of terrorism, with the advent of, again, these numerous what they call negative externalities in economics, such as climate change, loss of biodiversity, resource overshoot. As I mentioned earlier, we're using more resources each year than the planet can produce because we have a consumption economy. We're not even trying to be sustainable. It's because the economy can't be sustainable. It's opposed to it. So you add all these things together, and by around 2040, 2050, you have a very ugly scenario that's mounting, because for the first time in human history, we're actually running out of core resources, and we're destroying the planet in a way that we're not going to be able to come back from it without radical global change on the economic level within the next 2 decades.
So what do you think will happen if we don't have this radical change?
More destabilization, more basically everything that we're seeing right now from the early stages of climate change will continue. We will have resource scarcity because of the overshoot, because we're using too much. And once those things come into play, it's going to trigger all sorts of social destabilization, from increased terrorism to increased crime to more desperation. The 1%, the wealthy that have been extracting wealth from the public for centuries now, they are continuing to gain more and more wealth while the public is being pushed more and more aside. So you see that that's starting to become extreme. And this is where radicalism comes into play. In the United States, we have similar circumstances, even though we're considered one of the wealthier countries. We have a very, very poor population in the south of the United States fundamentally, and they are very, very hate-filled now, and they're willing to elect a president, say, like Donald Trump right now, who is the epitome of this type of xenophobic hatred that says we are going to be closed off, and we're going to close our borders, we're not going to be open, we're going to compete, we're going to make sure other countries are subservient to us. So you have this hard-lined ethic, and that's a very destructive place to be. And some have drawn parallels to after World War I, where you had all of these hard-line things come forward, and it burst into World War II, and we saw how bad the crimes against humanity were in World War II, and how much it was tolerated on multiple levels. We're not just talking Germany, but everyone engaged, even in the United States. All sorts of Japanese were placed in concentration camps. It is not far-fetched to see that type of scenario reemerge. I'm not trying to be fatalistic, but these types of things are cyclical. And if things get bad enough, like a water crisis or a food crisis, which we have been on the edge of for the past decade, if things don't change, I'm fearful of what can happen. I mean, all it takes is I'll give one more point. Unlike any other time in history, the advancement of technology has been amazing. It's been positive. We can create an abundance, we can resolve problems, we can use design and intelligent economic practices to overcome all of these things through technology and science. We're in Greece right now. This is the hub of intellectual development for the Western world. And it's unfortunate because that can also be used for destructive purposes. So the atomic bomb came forward, that was a terrible advent. But now, nanotechnology, we're worried about, again, terrorism. All it takes is a small group of disgruntled people with extremely advanced technology that they wouldn't have had 2 or 3 decades ago to make very serious damage occur where you might not be able to even come back from it. I mean, these types of things have been in fear for a long time, but they're going to become that much more probable. And the more competitive and antagonistic we become as a society, the more all of those things are going to become increasingly probable. And you can only imagine what can happen in the future with that type of ethic, especially in a high technology world, where we can do just as much positive as negative with our technology. Have you ever heard of the man Carl Sagan?
Yes.
He's a great American scientist, very humanistic, and he described how he made a joke. He's like, maybe there is a God, and he's given us these tools, and he says we can either fight and destroy ourselves with our advanced technology, like the nuclear weapon, or we can use them to create an abundance, to travel the universe, and to be peacefully coexisting in an advanced society. And that's the fork in the road, I think, right now, because it's going to move really rapidly one direction or the other, depending on what we do today.
No, until now, humanity seems to take the bad road.
Yes, everything points to the bad road, unfortunately. And that's why the Zeitgeist movement and other movements of this nature are trying to just shake some sense into the power establishment. I mean, the people, I think, would be willing to understand these needs, but because of the need to work every day and the stress of existence, it's like a self-defeating cycle that even the well-meaning masses are unable to do much because they're so bound by their economic limitations and to take care of their families. They can't think about these ideas. It's hard. So we're trying to break through on that level as well.
Which do you think are the roots of this corrupted system that we see today, historically judging?
What are the roots?
What are the roots of all this?
It's oddly enough, it's natural, and to the extent where you go back in time to the Neolithic Revolution. And I've talked about this a great deal in a lot of my lectures. And the Neolithic Revolution was when we discovered agriculture. And agriculture forces a certain type of arrangement different from, are you familiar with this idea of okay. So before the Neolithic Revolution, people were hunters and gatherers and they moved around. Agriculture made people settle and be protective. No longer was it about freedom and mobility. I mean, you couldn't have a vanity-oriented way of thinking because you were mobile. You had a nomadic world. It was very, very different, very, very different. And we know this because we are aware of other nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes that are still in existence, or they were in existence in the 20th century, and we could study them. Many of them are gone now. And when agriculture came along, it created the foundation for what we call capitalism. Property, so you farm, you want to keep it because you put that labor into it, It created the need for exchange, so you specialize, you are milking cows and I'm growing corn, we trade, and trade as well. And so basically those elements are the core framework of what our economic system is. But as it became more complex, you ended up with the basis of war, because someone's over there by a freshwater pond and your tribe is over here, you might have to steal that pond if you become scarce. And we had literally thousands of years of this mindset of scarcity and fighting, and that was just the way it was, and that we couldn't have changed it back then. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, which is what began, the creation of what eventually became smaller and smaller technology, more and more efficiency, we didn't change our mindset. We still kept this competitive, exploitative dominance ethic. And the British East India Company, they dominated the world through colonialism. It was right around this area that the Industrial Revolution kicked forward. And we haven't changed since that, because that point is what completely altered our paradigm. we had advancing technology, advancing mechanization, advancing means of production. We could produce more and more. We found increased measures of energy, such as oil. We shot the population up, 70-fold over the course of a very short period of time. And in a certain sense, that was great, but we didn't learn. We didn't learn that this premise, of the original premise of capitalism, property exchange, competition, dominance, exploitation, the years of slavery. We've had slavery, as we know, in ancient Greece writing. Aristotle thought slavery was natural. As smart as he was obviously incorrect on that one. But since that time, since the 18th century, we persist to assume that that old model of economics is what is correct. It's not. So we have to adapt to this new advancing state of technology, and we have to, because we can destroy faster than we can be productive now. So it would be very difficult for us to use resources faster than they would be produced, because back then you had a very primitive means of producing food. We didn't have. Like today, people can make a pair of shoes every 10 seconds through factories. Back then, it would take, a shoemaker and a handicraft in the medieval period, it would take him days just to make one pair. So this ability to create an abundance and post-scarcity, and that gets to the heart of what this event is tomorrow, this isn't respected. We're still stuck in the scarcity worldview, as opposed to post-scarcity, which means, okay, we're going to shift the economy, we're going to focus on conservation and efficiency, seeking to produce an abundance. It might sound contradictory, but once you focus on efficiency and meeting human needs, all of the tendencies towards overconsumption, they go away because they're not necessary, because the consumption-driven, scarcity-driven economy, of the market, which needs, again, consumption to work. Like if we stop buying and consuming, the economy collapses. That's not the way economy should be in a post-scarcity world. You produce based on what people need, and then that's the end of it. I mean, people are going to have an abundance, they'll have the same things that they would have now, but you don't have that drive of consumption that we've had since the beginning of the Neolithic, post-Neolithic period. Does that make sense? Because I've gone a few different tangents on that. So we have to adapt to what is required now to be sustainable and efficient, and the key word is basically efficiency. And we're not efficient in the capitalist economy, not even close. We can't even allocate. I mean, everything is going in misallocation due to how bad the system is, which is why 1%, which is why 62 people in the world own as much money as half of the planet. So you can't call that an economy. That's not an economy. Economy needs to allocate, needs to be efficient. We have an anti-economy. It wasn't always like that. It wasn't always bad. It was what it was. But once the Industrial Revolution happened, it set us on a different course, and now it's time to change.
But we don't watch some attempt from academics, from economists, from the governance that we have globally to have a radical change. People do not see that the system is not going nowhere.
Well, it's natural to those that achieve power to not want to change what put them in power. So if you're wealthy, most people that are in the political circles come from some kind of wealth foundation, or at least they've achieved wealth. And it's basic kind of operant conditioning, If you work and you get millions of dollars and you get to a high position, you want to convince yourself that you deserved all of that and whatever mechanisms were used. So that's a big cognitive dissonance, they call it. There might be plenty of people out there that may believe in the principles of this, but once they step back and look at themselves and where they are in their position, they shy away very, very rapidly. So it's not difficult to understand why the political establishment, especially since it's run by business. Business is the foundation of our society, and it's naive of any of us to think that business wouldn't interfere with the political establishment. You know what I mean? Everyone talks about this in America because America is specifically merged with business very much. And, they want to separate money and politics. We hear this rhetoric. I mean, some countries are far more corrupt. Like, Latin America has been so disturbed. They have a mafia mentality that runs many governments down there. And mafia, yeah. I mean, it's still mafia in America. Actually, I'd say it's mafia everywhere. Just different degrees of this type of interweaving where you're dealing with special interests and vested interests, and your first priority isn't the public, it's business. But then again, that's what this system is. I mean, the U.S. government is basically a corporation. And that's how it thinks about itself. That's how it operates, and its budgetary conception and its taxation. So if business is in power, business most certainly isn't going to want to eradicate itself, which is effectively what is required. We have to get away from business. Business is the problem. Business is not a reputable thing. There's not going to be a green economy. There's not going to be a socially concerned economy. These things are too contradictory to the foundation of exploitation, seeking advantage, dominance, and competition, all the things that are foundational to the world today.
So how would you imagine the transition from the old model, from the current model that we have now? You have a proposition, Venice Project.
Well, yeah,
that's... how exactly do you visualize this transition?
Well, that's a good question. I think that obviously that's the whole point, and to approach it as a step-by-step process, and that's there's two ways to think about it. You've asked a very large question, and the first way is that it's actually very easy to do it if we did it step by step, and we were able to take certain industries, you apply the most efficiency to them, and then you remove them from the business environment. It's very similar to what we've done with socialization in like Norway or Sweden. There are certain services that occur that are given to the public, and that it's socialism in its most generalized form, right? You could do this step by step, and at the same time you're redesigning the entire architecture of the economy, and it would not be difficult to do that if you had the sanction of the population and government. And that's the real problem. I could talk to you for about an hour on how to do it step by step. I've written about it. It's in a book that we put out for the movement, so people can read all of these proposals. It's not a difficult thing to conceive of.
Which book is this?
It's called The Zeitgeist Movement Defined. It's free. You can download it for free at thezeitgeistmovement.com. But the real problem is we don't have the sanction of any government for this, and that is where activism and the need to impose the will of the people on the power establishment is so critical. Luckily, in certain countries, in Finland and some other places, they've been talking about universal basic income. This is a fairly radical proposal in light of the way the economy functions and assumes the way the world's supposed to be. You're supposed to work for a living, and anything that you do for welfare is supposed to be looked down upon. You know, this is the way the ethic is in America. And the idea of having universal basic income is a contradiction of those things. And you're basically saying that you're going to get rid of poverty, and that's a profound place to be. And again, that will be talked about tomorrow. And I hope that that's one step that will come forward to alleviate these issues. My point is that there are certain ways to get towards this type of transition without going the full length. And we have to think that way. We can't just think, okay, boom, boom. We have to realize the whole point of this type of transition is to improve public health and to increase our environmental sustainability. And anything that moves in that direction is going to be positive. But as far as activism is concerned, there needs to be a massive number of people that basically, like Occupy, like there's to be a type of uprising like Occupy that stifles the system, and then it just says we're going to listen to public appeal, and that public appeal is set in motion and put forward. And at that stage, all these other proposals I mentioned, the step-by-step, can be talked about. But until we see an uprising of some kind, I don't mean like a revolt or an insurrection. I mean, there has to be some kind of, not necessarily even political, there has to be a social concentration of focus so large that the establishment steps back and knows that it can no longer sit there and ignore what people are asking for. I mean, it is a protest environment, but it's not, I don't know. There's a lot I can say about that, and that's exactly what the movement is trying to gather. We refer to ourselves as the largest grassroots movement in the world, which is probably true, considering what we're doing, but it's not even close to as big as it's required to be in order to get this type of thing moving forward. So we're hoping to keep spreading.
Do you strongly believe that this kind of activism can change the world? It can overthrow this system? Because we have seen a lot of examples that the system takes advantage of this movement.
In what sense? Take advantage?
Takes advantage, it suppresses them very easily, or it makes these movements to be part of it.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that the ignoring and the demonizing and the using attributive language, say, to old ideas that have been considered failures, such as communism or Marxism, these are the easiest ones. Yeah. These are the ones that are thrown out to propagandize any kind of move against the current system. Those games will continue to be played, and they've been very, very successful, over the course of time. There's no denying that. So that is something that the people that are interested in this have to overcome. They have to learn that they're going to be labeled in certain ways. I've been labeled, and I've had many moves against me in that way to discredit and things like that. And that just goes with the territory. And with something like the internet, it becomes a different reality because it can embrace many, many people without what used to be, say, public gatherings. You know, it was very, very hard back in the day to do this type of work because you were so transparent, and the capacity to create mass interest could easily be stifled much faster than it is now. So we have that to our advantage. Without the internet, it would have been very, very difficult for any of this to start, of course. So, I think, I'll put it this way, the pressures that are emerging are so strong between the environmental issues, the debt issues, and the social destabilization. And either people know the proper thing to do, which is to ask for and request and demand and to help create this type of new economic model, or it's going to go the wrong way. And people are going to develop the worst tendencies, and they're going to become more extreme, and the insurrections, this can become more destabilized. And that our goal is to make sure that once these pressures hit that point, people know to go the right way. You know what I mean? These pressures are the problems of climate change, the problems of biodiversity loss, the problems of resource overshoot, the problems of debt collapse. By 2050, 60% of the entire world will be bankrupt. The country, 60% of the countries will be bankrupt. That's crazy. That's where we're heading, though. So how are we going to afford all the changes in the energy infrastructure that's required right now? How are we going to afford all the policing and all the requirements that are needed to make sure corporations are actually staying in some sustainable bounds? These things are not going to happen these types of changes are not going to happen without those pressures, and the goal is to get people to know which direction to go. So that's what I hope the movement can accomplish. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So
what position does money has in your model, in your visualization? Because as we have seen in your documentaries, the way that money works is the basic reason why everything is corrupted and the world doesn't go well.
Well, it's not.
Do you imagine the ruling god of money, or in another form? How do you?
In transition, there's other ways you could deal with that small percentage that can't be automated, or that can't be done through efficiency and created with an abundance. I mean, we already know we can create a vast abundance for most things. Food, energy, we can have clean water, the vast basic resources, but there are other things that aren't quite there yet. They require more advancement. There's that small marginal element. There's a concept called a zero marginal cost, and this is an important concept because it embraces that more with less thing I mentioned earlier. And to describe it simply, if you have a machine that costs $1,000 to make, the first thing you create with that machine cost $1,000, all things being equal, right? The second thing you create costs $500. The third thing you create costs $250, and so on. It's cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as long as that machine has integrity. The internet is the perfect example. You and I can trade music into infinity. A band can make a movie. I can make anything, and digitally, it's zero marginal cost. And that's where everything is headed. But there's always that tiny marginal cost. So how do you deal with that? Yeah. Well, it could be the maturity of the society. You can understand that that's there and respect it. It's something that I think will eventually happen. Or you can have very small incentive things. It's a step-by-step process. Excuse me, very minor forms of currency that could come in as I'm not sure how to describe this. Very nominal needs for exchange, such as through Bitcoin, or things that are not within the current structure. They're not based on debt. There's an organization called Technocracy that existed in the 1930s. They proposed energy credits for this type of thing, and it was a type of exchange system, but it was based on a certain calculation of energy. It's very specific back then. So that's an intermediate step. I think that we could get beyond that once people realize the nature of the system and they're not obsessed with the type of vanity and overconsumption and consumerism and proprietary neuroses that we've cultivated through the current system. So ideally that it doesn't exist, but there could be something in the intermediate, and whatever that currency is, whether it's energy credits or the like, it's not going to be based on debt. You would calculate it. The closest thing is Bitcoin. Bitcoin has a unique type of calculation that they do. what it would be extended to is actually accounting for the materials that have been produced. I could go on a long tangent about this, but you can create a currency that's not based out of debt if you use technology to track its value, not based on floating exchanges and all the things we do now, but you actually attribute it to the value of the goods produced. So it's theoretically possible that you could create an intermediate currency using money with that type of tracking system, but it requires a very advanced system to do that. And once you have that advanced system of tracking, it makes it even less necessary to have money because you're able to make all the calculations and feedback immediately anyway. So you're able to increase that much more efficiency. I apologize if that's a little bit too complicated for this discussion, but I hope that makes sense. The Internet of Things, have you heard of this new advent of the Internet of Everything and this concept of connecting as much as possible through the Internet? This is the type of networking that's required to create the economic efficiency that's needed in order to generate the efficiency.
You have heard a lot of criticism about your work, about Zeitgeist. A lot of people say that the facts that you present do not exist.
No.
What, in general, what would you have to reply to the critics?
Simple. I wrote a 220-page book on that. It's free. I didn't publish it. It's just an internet book because I wanted to respond. And it documents every single thing that's in the movie. And anyone can find that at zeitgeistmovie.com. It's called the Zeitgeist Source Companion Guide. And I remember the backlash, especially things in the religion section that were brought up, and people just didn't know where they came from and thought they were made up. And they were not. Everything that's in that film is documented and sourced, and reputably so. It's just the way the film was constructed, it's very fast-paced, so people are unable to, and it's not sourced on screen, so I can see why people would just be confused. But that's the nature of the movie. Yes. So it requires people to look and follow up.
Yes. And you also hear a lot of criticism about the first Zeitgeist, where you talk about religion. Mm-hmm. A lot of people feel offended to hear something, but...
Well, I know. It wasn't my intention to offend. I was just trying to present the facts, and at least what I think are the facts. It's very difficult when you study comparative religion to completely understand what's happened over the course of thousands of years. But I'll say this, there's no single narrative to any religious mythology, even the Greek religion, the Roman religions. There's nothing singular about the meaning that there's one text. The Judeo-Christian religion has numerous gospels, many, dozens. These characters that they present, whether it's Moses or Jesus, they exist in multiple realms simultaneously in writing. They only recognize the canonical gospels, and that's what everyone thinks is the true text. But the truth is that there's numerous texts, and that's what people don't realize when they criticize. They say, well, no, this God wasn't born on this date. Well, they're not looking at the right source, because there's not one source. Yeah. So that's what makes it difficult.
You chose to have Greece for this year, for the Z Day. Mm-hmm. Greece is in the spotlight of the economic crisis all the last years. And a lot of people here, watching the Zeitgeist, feel that you refer especially to us. What is your view about what is going on in our country the last years?
Oh, it's terrible because there's a micro and a macro kind of phenomenon that occurs with our economic system. Yeah. The micro is the class structure within a country. So you have the lower, middle to upper class. And it's the middle and lower class, the ones that always get the short end of the stick. It's just the way the system is. The system is organized based on advantage, and as many theorists have actually said, you have this propensity of what they call socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. There's too big to fail, just countries are too big to fail as well. And that brings me to the macro level, where you have the United States and China and Russia and the large empires, pseudo-empires. These countries are not susceptible to the same things the smaller countries are, such as Greece or Argentina or the many other countries that have had periodic debt collapse because of credit expansion and all these things. So Greece isn't a rare case in this. I mean, if you go back and look at the history of Europe and what's happened over the past 3 or 4 decades, it's been a cyclical problem. It's just gotten a little bit worse now overall because the total cumulative debt on the planet continues to grow. So we return to my original premise that we mentioned before this started. There's more debt in existence than there is money. And that means bankruptcy is inevitable, both for the individual, the lower class, and the lower class countries. which Greece would consider a lower class country. It's not poor, but it's not a super wealthy country. It's susceptible, it's small, it takes loans from international institutions, and it starts this chain reaction, just as we saw actually most notably in Latin America. Some of the worst austerity and structural adjustment policies were done in Latin America and really very much ravaged that culture, and it puts them in the position that they are today. The ethic of this is that it attempts to sanctify that the financial system is legitimate, because there's no reason for Greece to have done what it did. I mean, there's no reason for it to have been in such debt or for it to have gone through the austerity and the problems that it did. And frankly, it's a completely violent thing that's been going on for government to sanction this and to participate in the world financial institutions, because the world financial institutions aren't real either. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they are taking money from other collective organizations, other collective countries, like the United States, which is one of the biggest controllers of it, and they make money out of nothing, and then they loan it to countries and put them in debt, and then they force them to pay more money back than often their GDP even creates. Like this is the case in many Latin American countries specifically. Literally more money is paid out servicing debt than they're actually taking in, which is crazy, which is, it's hard not to look at it from the standpoint of one very large-scale exploitative move. Just as you have a poor person, maybe exploited in a sweatshop somewhere, you know what I mean? Just if you have a lower-class individual that is in debt and they have to work someplace they don't like or for very low wages. A lot of these countries that have been put in this position, not necessarily Greece, you see that transnational corporations will go and move in when they're very, very vulnerable. This is, again, it's not as much prevalent to Greece, but
like IMF, you think a transnational organization?
Well, IMF is more of an international banking institution, but transnational, I mean like corporations, like large-scale commercial corporations, textile industries, and energy industries. Textiles have been probably the most notable. So, and the numerous theorists have talked about this. So countries in a great deal of debt, they take on loans, they go through austerity, and they're vulnerable, and suddenly a big textile industry moves in and exploits the labor for 50 cents an hour. It's a chain reaction, and suddenly that entire country becomes somewhat subservient to the external world. And that is precisely the definition of debt bondage and slavery. The oldest form of slavery on the planet is debt bondage. It goes back 5,000 to 6,000 years at a minimum, based on recorded history. Even before abject slavery, debt bondage was, and it's still in existence today, unfortunately. About 27 million slaves exist in the world today, based mostly on debt bondage. Which is, by the way, more slaves than any time in human history. We've had population increase, of course, so it's not the same percentage terms. And that same rationale applies to what the countries go through, because it trickles down. And I haven't looked at what has happened as far as the exploitative processes with Greece, but I'm sure that in the bowels of the IMF and the World Bank and other lending countries, they look at Greece as something that they're trying to take advantage of and extract their money from. And they rationalize it that way. They're not saying, let's go exploit Greece. They're saying, well, we need to get our money back. How are we going to do it? Let's get these industries in there. Let's force them to lower all their standards for their workers. Let's remove their welfare systems, make them even more vulnerable. So this is what's happened. So I mean, it's a violent pattern. And the sad thing is these people in power don't realize what it actually means. They don't realize. They just see it as business, and it's real lives that have been destroyed. I know that's a continual problem. And it'll be, if it's not Greece or Argentina, it'll be somewhere else. It's just going to keep moving along because that's what the debt system does. I would say as an activist, the first thing that could do as a step-by-step, back to your question about transition, and many things I could say, but removing the debt system, forcing at least, there has to be a certain allowance where debt forgiveness becomes obvious, where you're not going to torture an individual or a country with this anymore once it's clear that they can't do it. You have to have debt forgiveness, which used to be more popular, believe it or not, the Jubilee, the debt Jubilee. They even talk about it in very, very ancient texts because this is a long-standing problem. I will say one thing about debt, just to clarify why there's more debt than money, is because there's interest charged on it, right? Once you charge interest on loaned money, and again, all money comes into existence from loans, you can pay the loan back, but how are you going to pay the interest if all the money that's in existence was loaned at interest? Meaning, I loan you $1,000, and I charge you 10% on it, you can pay me back the $1,000, but you actually owe me $1,100. And when you stretch that across the entire society, you always have more debt in existence than money. So I hope anyone that hears that understands the mathematical reality. And all that does is move money to the upper classes. It's taking all of that money and bankrupting people, taking their assets. That's what banks do when you fail. Obviously, it's different for a country, but that's what happens with the individual. So it's a completely classist and detrimental, manipulative, and corrupt process. And yet we accept it as normality. People walk into a bank and take a loan, they think it's normal. It's not. It's a terribly corrupt phenomenon.
Yes. Yeah. I have heard you in some interviews that you are very fond of direct democracy, referendums. You believe that the people should have the power.
I'm sorry, go on though.
Yeah. We had a very famous referendum in the last summer here in Greece against the austerity measures from our left coalition government. And the Greek people said no with a big percentage.
Yep.
But the Greek government, having pressure from the national committees, had to say yes to the austerity measures. So, do you strongly believe that people have really have the power to take the fate in their hands? Because this is an example that whatever people is saying, what has to be done, it has to be done.
Well, in the current circumstance, it's very limited. So referendums are probably the closest thing, and they're very minor, really, when it comes to direct democracy. And the fact that, as you just said, they're not respected, well, you know, what can you do? It goes to show that this kind of idea of rights and liberties and democracy seems to be more of a privilege to society, doesn't it? Yes. It seems like the society, just most countries sort of allow a certain degree of it when they think it's okay, which goes to show just how bad power has become and how tolerant people have become too. You know, again, there's a colossal misunderstanding. People become accustomed to these things, and then time goes on, and then they wonder why things have gotten so bad. Because I'll put it bluntly, in any kind of market-driven society where property values and again, the ethic of competition and exploitation and all these things that have been going on, within that structure, how do you engage democracy? Because it can all be bought, first of all. And second of all, money will be the bridge of everything. So the reason Greece probably caved is because of their financial debts, and they're probably going to be, well, clearly because of their financial debts, but it had ramifications for their economy deeper. They're being threatened deeply about other things that happened in their economy, and it's only going to get worse for them if they didn't, and they're backed into a corner because of those pressures. So within that, within that architecture, you can't have a real democracy. Now, I won't go so far to say that it doesn't exist and we shouldn't think about it or try, because obviously we should. We have to do whatever we can. Yeah. But until people realize that in a market economy, you're only as free as your purchasing power is, and your contribution to society is exactly the way they talk about it in economics, which is through your money. That's what they say in traditional economic theory. You vote with your dollar, right? That's what they claim is the democracy of economics, right? Well, that goes the other direction, doesn't it? Because if you have lots of money, then you can vote to manipulate democracy. You can have lots of money, and you can make decisions based on your self-interest and control democracy with that same money. So if you have those positions of advantage, you can do whatever you want. And you're also, as I said before, going to cave very rapidly to economic interests that are going to interfere with your work. And it's the first priority of any politician is to preserve its industries. That's what creates its jobs. That's why all politicians talk about jobs first and foremost at this point in time. And the only way they can do that is to make sure that they are in concert with the dominant corporate powers in their country or in the world. And that's the root of the corruption in general. So there's a limit to it, and that's why we have to look beyond it. I don't believe in the political system as it exists today whatsoever. That's why I advocate a grassroots organization that I do. I don't think lobbying politicians is going to do much of anything, which makes it that much more difficult.
We have seen that a lot of technological advancement already exist, but we don't see them apply in a big scale so that they could lead to a social transformation. How do you believe this could be done so that humanity could use more to its advantage the technology that we have?
Yeah, well, that goes back to the effectively the stopping of the system that's based on inefficiency. So when you have a model that makes money off of scarcity, which is what we have now. So you own a company and you produce something like a phone. The last thing you want is to produce that so efficiently that no one comes back to buy it again, right? I mean, we see Apple, for example, in America. They're struggling right now to get people to repurchase the same things over and over again. That's their model, by the way. And they use planned obsolescence to make sure their phones fail or their tablets fail fairly soon. They plan these things in stages. It's corrupt, but that's what the model is. It's based on scarcity, and in order to keep people employed, to keep GDP going, people have to keep buying things. And that's in direct contradiction to the efficiency that you just mentioned. That is natural to the system because, you know, we're just developing better efficiency. It's a natural process of that post-Malthusian thing, the more with less. But we don't understand how to use it properly, as I said before, so we're getting technological unemployment now, so it's becoming more cheap to use machines than human labor, and that is, again, a direct contradiction, and the system's trying to figure out what to do with that. It's very, very caustic. The only thing that can happen is to get out of the system and stop this labor for income, and effectively, to get to your point, stop this exploitation of scarcity and actually seek pursuing abundance. If you shift the entire economic system to focus on abundance, you have a completely new world. Like, it's a completely new way of thinking about what you're doing. You don't want to reproduce things over and over again to sell them. You want to create things that last, that are malleable, and they can be updated, and they're modular, and you're harnessing the most advanced techniques at all times. And once you are capable of doing that, you can create a global abundance. You can satisfy the demands on the planet. The only thing you can hope for in this system is something like universal basic income to supplement the technological unemployment, and then to elevate people up, reduce the workday, and give people more money per hour. These are all great things. Will they happen? Well, they're so contrary to the way people think in terms of what our society is supposed to be in capitalism that I don't know. I don't know if they'll happen. People were talking about this in the 1930s. When the first rise of technological, mechanization and automation were happening and especially in the United States and London, the very beginning of this second industrial revolution, they called it, people were talking about it back then, saying, we don't have to work anymore. But what happened? It's exact opposite now. Even now, all of everyone's wives work. They didn't work back then. Families are torn apart. There's people working more hours than they ever have. There's more stupid jobs than we've ever had. We've created and manufactured these artificial jobs to keep people employed, all sorts of nonsensical things that makes no sense whatsoever. It's just wasting people's lives. So those things could happen, and I think, as going back to your question on transition, I'm still not satisfied with my answer, by the way, that's why I keep bringing it up. These steps could also help quite a bit. If we lobbied for the universal basic income and the reduction of the work week and the increase of wages to compensate for the efficiency that's being created, then you'll gravitate towards a society that's willing to do more with less and to not want to produce as much, meaning they not repeatedly produce for the sake of buying, you know what I mean? So we can still create an abundance, but not just consumption.
Have you noticed that maybe the interest, the big corporation, and the system as a whole would stop any efforts, any technological advancements that will lead to this,
yes.
to this vision? I ask this because the last months we have here in Greece a scientist, he's called Petros Zographos, who has developed a machine which can produce electricity from just water. It works, and now he's in the process of establishing it globally. Would you expect this to be accepted since the big interest, the big corporation would lose a lot of money with the establishment of, for example, such a development?
Yeah, I think you already know the answer to that, because historically there's numerous examples of criminal conspiracies by corporations, especially in the United States, to stop changes to their industries. We see it now with the oil industry. The oil industry is still funneling tons of money into anti-climate change people, deniers. Yes. They're polluting the argument. There are at least, I can think of many examples throughout the course of American history, because that's where I'm from, so I know it the best, where industry has come forward with cartels to shut down things like efficient railways in favor of automobiles. The Rockefellers and Standard Oil, they went way out of their way in the early 20th century to stop public transit in favor of cars. which was very, very wasteful. There was a whole plan to do all sorts of stuff in Los Angeles and New York and big cities to improve transit and railways, and they lobbied and did all sorts of things, and they're prosecuted for it. You can look that up. It's very interesting. It's not just a theory. It's a true criminal conspiracy. So those things are there. In the 1930s as well, when the Great Depression occurred, they actually went to Congress and they tried to appeal, they being industry, they tried to stop technological advancement. If you can believe this, they actually wanted to do a moratorium, it's called, on people automating and applying technical efficiency to labor because of the Depression, and which is nuts. If you think about what that actually meant, that means we want you to stop being scientific and stop developing. So all that stuff is there historically. And yes, it's anything that comes forward that's too efficient is going to be shut down. But that's just what the system's reaction is. And you can rest assured that the lobby against renewable energy and the like is going to persist. And you know it very clearly in the States when you look at the billions spent on it, compared to, say, Europe, which is more intelligent in this regard, because half of the United States doesn't even believe in climate change. I mean, the science is right there. They just are so groomed by their TV media to doubt it because of all the money that's being funneled into this for the sake of the oil industry, that they don't even believe it. So the culture has even been hijacked in America.
And perhaps this is the reason we see a very slow progress of renewable energy sources.
Exactly. No, the renewable stuff in the electric car, the electric car goes back 200 years. I mean, it's unbelievable that it hasn't been completely. I mean, if there was any intelligence, there would be a mandate to do these types of conversions step by step, and industry would be pushed aside.
About everything that we discussed now, would you believe that it is a matter of values, of our values as humanity, and so we could change our educational system first, so that to change our values
yeah.
So that to make most people to accept those changes.
Well, the values
maybe it goes back to our early stage of our lives, so that maybe we will need different values as we grow up, because we grow up and we want to be rich and have money and be a part of it. How will this be changed?
It's very interesting to think about human values and how susceptible we are to our culture, and because we want to think we're individual and that we're thinking in our own volition and free will, and that we're in control of ourselves and our minds and our values, and that's of course not true. We're so susceptible to our environment and each other, and the value system of consumerism. A lot of people don't know this, but in the early 20th century, the National Association of Manufacturers, there was an old organization, kind of like basically a conglomerate of manufacturers, and they had this organization. They spent millions and millions and millions of dollars convincing the public through television ads and movies and books and all ages, educational curriculum stuff, that consumerism was the most important thing that this country needs. It was one of the biggest psychological moves in this post-industrial era after World War II of probably anything I've ever seen, even though it's not really talked about. Before this time, there was more of a puritanical ethic in America, and in Europe in a lot of ways as well, before this consumerism took hold. But the reason that they needed that value of wanting to be rich and have lots of things is because the economy wouldn't work otherwise. If people maintained those values and had the more with less phenomenon and the efficiency that we created with the Industrial Revolution, and they literally were satisfied with what they had, which they could have been. I mean, we don't know anything about what the future holds. You know, I mean, if we didn't know what a cell phone was, we wouldn't want it. You know what I mean? So we become manipulated by this idea of fitting in, and our social nature gets the best of us when other people start to get things and we want them, and that's what this consumerism did with advertising specifically. You know, it's why it's so social when you look at an advertisement. That's what the manipulation is. So to me, what this signifies is it's the structural demand of capitalism and consumerism, for consumption, with cyclical consumption that's required, and it's been transposed and mutated into the individual's value. It's like the system demand has become part of the individual because of generations of cultural grooming, and that's frightening. So we have to look at it and remember that that's how these things have occurred. Now, how do you change that? You have to be aware of it. people have to look at themselves and try to stop those reactions that are actually happening quite natural to us. Not feel inferior when they see someone wealthy walk down the street. Lots of things like that. At the same time, I think anyone that's uberly wealthy that drives around in a Ferrari or a Porsche or a $200,000 car, they should be shamed. They should. What they really signify is a kind of violence, a cultural violence that they're representing all of the suffering that has gone into for them to have that privilege, because that's how it happens. Nobody in the 1%, if you will, has that because of their individual hard work. It's because of the massive exploitation of the masses. That's why the global north, America and Europe specifically, have so much material wealth. They've stolen it all from the global south through years of globalization and colonialism, specifically the British Empire and the American Empire too. People don't have any sense of synergy in this world. They don't feel connected enough. They don't realize what's actually going on. And I think if they did, if they knew how much suffering, like America, again, I come from that position because these people are so sheltered. As a young country, they are not exposed to international media in the way that they should. The type of media that they do show in America is so carefully groomed and so it's such a proponent of the current system, the American dream and capitalism and consuming, and you get what you work for and all that mythology, that they have cultivated a value system that's oblivious to the suffering of the rest of the world. They don't understand why it exists. They think poverty was always in existence. They don't realize it's been cultivated by the system through many years of exploitation. I think if people can see the suffering that this system has created and really understand it, then this internal revolution can manifest. But that takes a lot of education. And I think the big goal ultimately is to remove the imposing structure, and that again goes back to trying to transcend this entire economic structure. People are always going to be subject to their environment and always be kind of groomed to it. And people often say, for example, well, people are naturally greedy or people are naturally materialistic and want more and more, and that's just not true. It's a value that's being pulled from our economic premise. But that force, because it's so strong, it makes you think it's human nature, and that's really unfortunate. So anyway, I'm rambling a bit.
So is it or it is not?
It's not. No, human nature is adaptability. Human nature, we can collaborate. Social Darwinism. Charles Darwin came along, and people confused this term he used once. Social Darwinism. In fact, he didn't even groom it. He used something similar. Another theorist groomed social Darwinism, and people thought it was a validation of the competitive element of society, the survival of the fittest. But fittest doesn't mean competition, war, and strength. Fittest means your strategy of survival. It means it could just as much be collaborative as it could be competitive. And Darwin said that over and over again, but people have lost that. So humans will do whatever the circumstance requires. All of the neurological studies and about neuroplasticity, all of the anthropological studies throughout history that have looked at different cultures and how they behave in certain environments confirm this definitively. If we're in a competitive environment, like the entire world we live in, we're going to act competitively on average. If we're in a collaborative environment that says your survival and well-being depends on how well you engage me and collaborate, then we adapt in a collaborative way.
So it's all about making the correct environment.
Yes, that's the most important aspect of society.
Zeitgeist, moving forward, what's going on from now? What are your next plans, your next steps, and how do you see this movement evolve?
Well, we're on the 8th annual Zeitgeist Day, which is quite amazing. That it went. It started off as an experiment in many ways, and it took hold, and it's amazing to see what's happened. We're going to continue to expand projects. A big issue that we've been working on is to create some kind of, to develop an interface that brings the technological element, the programming stuff of how this new economy can work, and bring it out to the forefront and test it as per the scientific method. And this has been a difficult challenge because it requires a lot of time and energy to do the programming. But if you know the material fairly well, you realize that instead of a commerce and trade society, all of the interaction happens by digital feedback and people doing basically what they do in many ways in engineering, where they design things through CAD or computer-assisted design and engineering. Advanced forms of economic feedback can be created where you can show how all the information that we have through the price mechanism today can be done through the Internet of Things, for example, through the use of sensor structures and all the things that we already use in distribution. All this stuff is already there, but it hasn't been streamlined and put into a model. And we want to create this model and show it to the world in a completely operational way. And we can do it. We can do it hopefully within the next couple of years. It's going to take some time. That's one big project that I'll mention. But overall, we're just seeking to keep expanding and create more chapters and get this information moving out there as much as we possibly can. That's pretty much that's the goal. I mean, as far as myself, I do a lot of different media things, so I'll continue to produce as much media and writings and the like to help further this thing along as well.
You're developing now a new series about capitalism.
It's less about, well, it's broad. It's about capitalism, but it's about many things. It's related to the movement, of course, the same subject matter, but it's different. It's different in its approach. It's not a documentary. It's a live action expression of all of these things in a more kind of a creative way. So I'm kind of done with the documentary thing for now. I want to try different ways of affecting culture, and I think using the arts is very powerful. You know.
Are you optimistic about the future?
I am. I am optimistic. As I said before, the two paths are there, and it's whether we go down the negative path or the positive path. It's a gravitation, and I think right now, what I've seen, there's a big awakening across the world, and everyone is beginning to question the social structure. Unlike any time I've ever seen, people are talking about things that they never talked about before. Even the beginning of the movement 8 years ago, no one talked about post-scarcity. No one knew about ephemeralization or this more with less phenomenon. No one really thought about technical efficiency, and I hear this rhetoric now all over the place. Technological unemployment is an amazing step because the natural gravitation to automate labor, because it's cheaper, you're going to make unemployed people. And to me, that's a phenomenal step. It's natural, it's phenomenal because people are going to say, well, what are we doing? Well, if this is the way our development is working in an economy, why are we working at all? So the question is starting to be raised in people's minds. And I think if we're all persistent, it will spread rapidly and virally, and we'll be able to get through this trying period. Let's hope.
Thank you very much for this interesting discussion.
Sure, thank you very much.